afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to give folks a couple of seconds to funnel into the room. We're really excited that you were able to join us today for our voting rights panel webinar, and just giving folks a second or two to come into the room to join our lovely panel and to get this conversation about voting rights started. We hope that you're enjoying this panel from wherever you're watching, from Facebook, Instagram, or whatever other source that you're able to join us. We're really excited to have you. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Eliana Green. I'm a reentry attorney at Root Rebound Reentry Advocates, as well as a policy advisor at the Hood Incubator, and we're really excited to have you join Expungement Week. Expungement Week is Expungement Week of Action and Awareness is the signature event of National Expungement Works. National Expungement Work started back in 2018 as an awareness campaign around providing expungement relief and wraparound services to communities affected by the war on drugs. The organization offers services year-round. However, their Week of Action and Awareness is their signature event, where cities around the country organize and host free events with legal aid for expungements, as well as clearing and sealing records and other wraparound services. So the Week of Action aligns with the 7 core values of the organization, which are healing, solidarity, creation, ascension, dedication, legacy, and fellowship. So I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing from me, so I'm excited to bring our panelists forward and have you all meet them. We are graced to be joined by a panel of experts of directly impacted folks and community members and advocates who support our impacted loved ones. I would like for all of our wonderful guests to introduce themselves, share the mission of your organization, as well as your position within the organization, and where you're located throughout the country, since we're in a national panel. And we also love to hear what your individual relationship with the criminal justice system is.
So hi, my name is Carmen Garcia. I am the new executive director of Root and Rebound. I am formerly incarcerated myself. And the vision of the organization is we have a really strong model, but my vision is to strengthen that model by strengthening our policy and advocacy and litigation so that we can make the changes at the higher levels and make sure that they impact and benefit people on a larger scale. And so that's one piece of it. Another piece is being very inclusive of the population. We serve people like me, systems impacted people, bringing on or creating fellowships in the organization where we give opportunities to systems impacted people. And that could be people that were in prison, or it could also include their family members who are out looking for jobs to be able to support their loved one that's incarcerated or a loved one that's struggling on the outside. So so that's part of my vision, is to create at least 3 fellowships to systems impacted people. And so we are actually a legal service organization, and our mission is to restore power and resources to the families and communities that have been most harmed by mass incarceration. And so we do this through legal advocacy, public education, policy reform, and litigation. So thank you.
Nice. Next, I'd like to welcome Bruce. If you could introduce yourself, please.
Hey, thanks, Eliana. I'm Bruce Reilly. I'm the Deputy Director of Voice of the Experienced and Voters Organized to Educate here in New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm also a founding steering committee member of the National Coalition, the Formerly Incarcerated Convicted People and Families Movement. And we fight, both our local orgs and our national coalition. We fight to organize and mobilize people for change in the criminal legal system, fight against the inhumanities, and to eliminate the discrimination that people face when they get the mark for criminal record. Personally, I engage a lot around policy reform. I have a law degree, which I earned after I got out of prison. I was a jailhouse lawyer on the inside. So I was able to put, what I learned on the inside to good use working with my community out here. And I've restored my voting rights in 2 states. And if I move again, I might have to do it in a 3rd.
Hey everybody, my name is Taina Vargas. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm the founder and executive director of Initiate Justice. And our mission is to end mass incarceration by activating the political power of currently incarcerated people, formerly incarcerated people, and their loved ones. I'm impacted by the system as I had a loved one in prison for 7 years who I supported. And I am located in Los Angeles, California. A big part of IJ's work is decarceration legislation, but we are also very involved in civic engagement of directly impacted people, because that is a very important power building strategy. And I will pass it to James.
Hello, my name is James Jetter. I am the co-founder and co-director of the Full Citizens Coalition. We are a rights protection coalition, as well as a carceral dismantling coalition. We've been running a campaign called Unlock the Vote since 2018. It was a campaign, much like Bruce said, to get his rights back, to get mine back, which we have successfully done as of July 1st. And we are now moving into to end suffrage in our state, and to expand our coalition to our community college campuses. So
Go next. Hi, I'm Brittany Stonesifer, she, her pronouns. I'm a staff attorney with the Democracy and Civic Engagement Program at the ACLU of Northern California. And what I usually work on is increasing access to voting and registration for all Californians, but with a particular focus in my work on increasing access for people with convictions or who've been affected by the criminal legal system. I've been with ACLU of Northern California for about 2.5 years now. And before that, I was with a grassroots California organization called Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, doing prison abolition work. So this work is kind of an intersection of my different areas of experience. So that's part of my experience with the criminal legal system. I also have a formerly incarcerated brother and some other formerly incarcerated family members. So thank you for having me on the panel today.
Thank you all for joining us. I'm excited for this all-star panel and to get into the conversation with each of these experts. As I mentioned, my name is Eliana Green. I'm a reentry attorney at Root Rebound. I'm also the policy advisor at the Hood Incubator. And the Hood Incubator is an organization dedicated to building a movement for cannabis justice so every Black person can generate wealth, health, and prosperity for their communities. So I had a really fun time doing some research to prepare for this panel and learning about each of your areas of work. So I do have some specific questions for each panelist, and then I have so that we can have opportunities to really hear what you've been working on. And then I do have some general questions so that we can get your mind going about like solutions and how we can work together across the states to navigate some of these barriers together. So my first question is for Carmen Garcia, the Executive Director of Root Rebound. So Carmen, between 96 and 2008, there were 9 states that passed requirements that formerly incarcerated and systems impacted folks be given information or assistance in regaining their voting rights at the time they complete their sentence. Progressively, more and more states across the country are making this a requirement, because even in places where voting rights are automatically restored, the truth is that this process is never automatic. So can you tell us about some of the obstacles that you personally faced in relation to your voting rights when you came home from incarceration? And then can you also talk to our audience about the importance of having legal information and access to legal information in terms of all topics, including voting rights, and having that information accessible to formerly incarcerated folks, as well as what your organization, Root Rebound, is doing to fill that need? Thank you, Carmen.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Eliana. Those are all really good questions. So to your first question about voting rights, and I'm happy to hear that that's actually, that's what should be happening, is that people coming home from jails and prisons should be, or should know their rights about voting, whether they can or cannot vote or eligible or not. So when I got out of prison, there was a huge election happening. And it was the re-election, re-election of Obama, Barack Obama. And so I was from people like, yes, you can vote, didn't give me any information on either way, or didn't even offer information. And I was even like scared to ask, because I was like, what if it's a setup? What if, could not vote, right? And so for me, it was just the idea of committing a new crime. Voting when I wasn't supposed to was just like not even something I was even going to entertain. So I, you know, to be safe, I just didn't vote, right? And so that was unfortunate because I realized that I had a right to vote, right? I just didn't know that I could vote. And so that goes to, you know, when I found out it was when I started working at Root and Rebound. And I realized that I actually did have rights, like that was my right to vote, and that I could vote. And I thought how what a huge difference that would have made for me if I had the resources, if I knew right for sure that I could vote and not worry about the consequences if I, you know, it wasn't supposed to and I voted. So anyhow, so that was so important to me to know that would have been very helpful. And I know, Eliana, you asked about the importance of like resources and why that matters. And so on a personal level, you know, when I was in prison, I remember asking for a number and an address of this nonprofit or organization. And I just wanted to get information because since I was already in prison, I wanted to get, you know, like empower myself with education and different just tools that were at my disposal, that I thought were at my disposal. And simply asking for an address and a phone number, I thought that shouldn't be a big deal, but it took the prison 8 months to get me that information. And when you think of how that the limited access and almost no access to information, right? How devastating that is when you're on the inside and trying to plan and make plans for your exit and what that's going to look like, and not be able to do that, I thought was like just such a disservice and a setup, right? We're, you know, I think in California, CDCR states that over 95% of the people currently incarcerated will be released at some point. And I thought, how can that be that they don't have the resources, like the resources don't exist? And so part of what we do at Root and Rebound, right, in addition to our hotline where people can call us, collect free of, we accept all collect calls, we also focus on the legal resources, the legal education. We published a Roadmap to Reentry Legal Guide back in 2015, the first of its kind, and it's like 1,200 pages, right? And so all that covered different areas of the barriers that people are experiencing when they come out. But what was interesting to me is that when I started and when we started working on the legal guide, that I started going over, just reviewing some of the information that we were going to publish. And so I thought, wait, this is from an attorney's perspective, it makes sense, right? The law says this is how things are supposed to be. But when I read it, I said, but that's not how it is, right? I mean, I get it that the law is this, but this is in reality, this is not what's happening, right? And so in providing that feedback directly, you know, providing that feedback, that also guided the attorneys and the team to include, right, different perspectives from people that actually had that lived experience and could either speak to the current laws as is, or the requirements, or even the expectations, and then also include like, however, right, this is how this, but however, this is what's actually happening, right? And this is how you can navigate. So that was really helpful. And what we started doing after that is consulting the experts, formerly incarcerated people in fields like, you know, just depending on the chapter. If the chapter was regarding education, who do we go? Who are the experts? Well, people at Project Rebound, people with lived experience who are in college, right? People who are the people that, parole and probation. Let's talk to the people that are actually experiencing legal issues with parole and probation, right? And get that feedback. And how do we incorporate it in the book? So I'm very proud of that. Like, that is huge, right? Because it's not textbook information that people are getting. No, it's actually from people with lived experience, people that have been there, done that, and are contributing to the resources to make sure that people, that the community gets the actual facts and is aware of like what is really happening and what is the process. And so I think that is crucial at Root and Rebound, that we made that part of our vision and mission is to empower and educate, right, the people that are most harmed by incarceration, incarceration. And so how do we do that? And so this is a huge piece, you know, and because that, in addition to like clinics, we also have clinics. We do facilitate clinics all through California, even in South Carolina, right? Because the need is there, the demand is there for people, from people who want to succeed, who want to have different opportunities. And so I've learned throughout the years how powerful knowledge is, right? And I'm living proof, right? Formerly incarcerated woman of color as an executive director, right? But there was a lot of hard work put into that, and a lot of like knowledge that I had to that I had to, in a way, reach out and find out for myself. But once at Root and Rebound and working with an amazing team of advocates, attorneys, right, that were able to guide me in different directions. But not everybody has that same opportunity, right? So it's different for me. But as an executive director, I want to make sure that I elevate that and also pull other people along and teach them. And, you know, it's a way to pay back. Each one teach one, right? That's the motto I learned when I was in jail, waiting to be transferred to federal prison, is each one teach one. And how do I do that? And so this is my time, this is my opportunity to live to that. So thank you, Eliana. I hope I answered your questions.
Yes, you certainly more than answered my question. Thank you so much, Carmen. I'm excited. I also heard you all just released a toolkit this year called A New Leaf, a how-to guide after a cannabis conviction. So speaking towards folks who have all types of drug convictions and providing them with resources on advocating for themselves. And I know you guys do teach outs on that as well. So it's exciting to have you in this position, and thank you for that very thorough answer. So my next question, I would love to ask Mr. Bruce Reilly. So Bruce, you're the Deputy Director of Voices of the Experience, as well as Voters Organized to Educate down in New Orleans, which I spent most of my adult life at, miss dearly. So I want to congratulate you and your organization on your recent success on getting Act 127 signed into law this past June, which expands access to voting for folks who are on probation. Could you tell us about your work on this issue, why it's important for folks who are on probation to vote? And can you speak to any other campaigns in the South which are currently going on fighting against voter suppression for systems impacted folks? Thanks, Bruce.
So thanks for putting this together and having me on. And you know, our work around voting rights goes back decades here. You know, our organization was originally founded inside of Angola Penitentiary, and people were organizing and mobilizing family members from the outside to kind of vote on their behalf, and changing some elections, and also drafted the first lifer parole law from inside prison, and then got some legislators to carry it. And so we've got a really storied history that we were able to take out of the penitentiary and try to rebuild out here and be much more powerful. So our voting rights campaign, you know, a lot of people didn't want to help out on it. You know, kind of nationally, they felt like it was, you know, it was dead in the water. You know, it was a lost cause. And so, you know, Louisiana, you know, being 49th or 50th and just about every single thing imaginable, you know, nobody really wanted to fight for civil rights here anymore. But we did, because we lived here, and it was our rights that we had to fight for. But ultimately, you know, after losing several times in the legislature with bills and, you know, trying to do the public education and mobilizing, you know, we took a much more robust strategy, and we had a litigation, a legislation, and also an electoral component, because our 501c4 organization, Voters Organized to Educate, can actually endorse and advocate to change, you know, who is in office. And so we don't want to just educate the people who are in office. We want to change who's in office and get rid of certain people and elevate others. And so we use elections as opportunities to talk about issues and change the culture and change the hearts and minds. And we were never going to change the sort of like partisan composition of our state. And so we knew what we were working with. So we can't appeal to people just through a party lens or even a racial lens, right? We have to appeal to people through a humanistic lens and really get them to be on board with the idea that folks that are living in the community should be encouraged to be part of the community. And voting is just one of those things. And so a few years ago, we passed Act 636, which was kind of a convoluted compromise from the bill that we originally drafted, which would have been pretty clean about who had the right to vote. And what it left was this as you were kind of mentioning earlier, some of the challenges that people face to get registered and to vote, even though they have the right to vote. And for us, Louisiana's got a storied history of all the different clauses and things where like Black people had the right to vote, but up until 1974, for the most part, voting percentage in Louisiana was somewhere around 10% amongst Black people, even though they had the right to vote, because they just all these methods of preventing people from accessing the ballot. So what we had was a situation where to register, you had to basically get your eligibility letter from probation and parole and bring it to the registrar. So it was kind of this two-part process to get registered. And these are the little nuances that are really important for community groups and lawyers and politicians to learn, as Carmen was saying, from people who are on the ground trying to register, trying to vote. If you've never gone through the process, you don't know whether there's a hurdle or not. And so when we see people nationally that are so-called voting rights advocates, but they only advocate for certain people. And so they're leaving out millions of folks who don't have voting rights, and then they're highlighting, let's say, thousands of others who have a slightly harder time accessing the ballot. And so it's a little frustrating to see that, and we've seen that for decades. So what the new bill did, Act 127, was it made it so people who were on probation, who we had already fought for and won that right to vote, but we were able to eliminate that little paperwork requirement that people would, you go to court on a Monday, you plead guilty to probation, no one even told you lost your right to vote, although you didn't really lose it. It got suspended automatically, but now you can go unsuspended. And so it's that type of thing where it took a lot of our advocacy and a threat of another lawsuit. And we work well with various partners. For a while now, with Advancement Project has been a big part of our legal team. We got some pro bono attorneys who've always been, along with us. And for me, as a legal nerd, it's been, one of the most fun processes the last 5 years or so that we've really been honing in on voting rights here in Louisiana. And the key is like just getting the right to vote is not enough, right? Like then what do you do with it, or how do you mobilize people? And so it's really that bigger picture, that wraparound advocacy. And so for us, like even right now, I mean, we're engaged in the city council and sheriff and mayoral races and clerk of court. And people don't always think about like the whole ecosystem of our issues. So for instance, the clerk of court is the one who is going to get all the jury pools for the juries. And some people likely know that Louisiana has a troubled history of juries. It was only recently we got rid of the 10-2 and 11-1 verdicts, which has thousands of people incarcerated when 2 people said not guilty, including, a portion of our staff had 10-2 verdicts. And so we got rid of that through a ballot initiative. It was a great statewide campaign. 64% of people and vote and voters organized were in position as organizations to do a statewide ballot initiative with all of our coalition partners. And so building strong organizations that can flex up as needed is really critical. But then thinking about these other little nuances to our democracy. So like this year, we passed a law that people with felony records can serve on juries, right? And so now you need a unanimous jury and people with records can serve on juries, right? So we're like eroding these systems of oppression that have been in place for centuries. And similarly, we passed what I think is a groundbreaking law that nobody's really talking about, which is a notification bill. Because as we know, like about 95% of all convictions are guilty pleas, right? But nobody tells you ahead of time when you're pleading the constitutional rights you're waiving, including your voting rights, your gun rights, your right to equal protection, which is to not be discriminated against, and your right to due process. And those of us that have been on probation or parole or whatever know that once you get arrested, your due process goes out the window. The Fourth Amendment goes out the window, the Fifth Amendment goes out the, they can start doing, they can detain you for so long without giving you any bail. And so people should be put on notice before they plead guilty. It should be a knowing and intelligent waiver. And it has to be a waiver of some other rights going back, half a century. This case, Boykin, you have to knowingly waive your trial rights. And so building upon that, we managed to get a very conservative legislature to agree that yes, people should know about these consequences of pleading guilty. And so we're hoping that that'll, get folks on the front end, not just the people who are dealing with their own personal rights, but public defenders who don't learn any of this stuff when they're in law school, prosecutors who are not necessarily concerned with, the lifetime impacts of a conviction, judges who hand out time like candy. And so we want to take this McDonald's drive-through system of discrimination, this apartheid that we're creating around the country, and slow it down, scale it back, and let people know just how vast of a system that it is. So we're all about getting voting rights, but using them and using them for good. And we've got a progressive district attorney here in New Orleans that we endorsed over the endorsements of all the mainstream Congress people, mayor, everybody endorsed the person who would have been terrible, and we went for the upstart. And we also got 2 former public defenders to be judges now. So we're changing the landscape at the same time that we're exercising our right to vote. So there's nothing more fun than that, and having a vision and working towards it. To your other question about other voting rights campaigns in the South, I mean, I think one of the 2 very exciting things, in North Carolina, my comrade Daryl Atkinson and Forward Justice and their coalition, they had a piece of litigation suing for the right to vote, basically saying that the discrimination scheme is racially biased. And so they had a lot of great statistics and analysis that went into that. And they won the case at the district court level. The state appealed, and the intermediary appellate court upheld the appeal. So now it's going to go to the state Supreme Court, and we'll see where that goes. So that's a really exciting case that can impact tens of thousands of people in the here and now. And Kentucky's had a long-standing battle and scenario there where they've gotten a lot of people power movement, and they just need to really enshrine it. But the campaign I'd love to see really get moving, because I just think there's a lot of great, amazing people there, would be in Georgia. And I know that they've got folks that want to really hone in on a strong campaign. And I know lots of people who love to support people in Georgia and to really move it. And they've got one of the highest percentages of people who are under community supervision, paying taxes, living, raising families, trying to do right, who are being denied the right to vote. And so it's really hard for the system to stand back and say, we want you to do the right thing, and then don't let us. And so we have to always pull out that contrast and that rug pulling that they do to us and put them on the spot. And we managed to do that here. I did that previously when I lived in Rhode Island when I was on parole. You just have to keep on exposing the hypocrisy of the system that pretends it wants you to do right but won't let you. And I'll just leave it there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, Bruce, thank you so much. You really touched on a lot of really great points. Thank you so much for addressing the issues as folks are on probation. And then, this overarching issue of access to information and how can a person know what their rights are. So panels like these allow folks to have that access to information. Another thing that I really want to highlight is the need to take a multifaceted approach to addressing the law. So not only the legislature, but you mentioned through voter initiatives, as well as through litigation and all of these other tools that we can use within the law to push our agenda forward. And so really that's a great segue to my next 2 panelists who use a combination, one of, voter initiatives and another through the legislature to do just that. So I know we previously talked about voting rights while on probation, but many of our loved ones are on parole. So I kind of want to switch gears a little bit and reintroduce this issue of voting while on parole. And so now we are going to switch to Mr. James Jeter, as well as Taina Vargas. So Taina, I'm going to start with you, followed by James. So we're excited to have you both. Taina, you are the founder of and executive director of Initiate Justice in California. And James, you are the founder and executive director of Full Citizens Coalition to Unlock the Vote in Connecticut. Our audience is excited to get voices from both the East Coast and the West Coast so we can get a kind of national feel of what's going on. But you both had recent legal victories to restore voting rights for folks who are on parole. Could you both tell us about the importance of restoring voting rights for folks on parole? and highlight work on the West Coast as well as the East Coast and around the country generally that has been done specifically on this issue that you work on. And so I want to highlight this for the audience. You know, in the last 2 years, we've had a whole lot of states pass laws. So Connecticut in 2021, New York as well as 2021, Washington, California in 2020, and Colorado in 2019. So in the last 2 years, we've had a lot of movement on this issue, and it's a, you know, a nationwide issue. So thank you all.
Thanks, Eliana. I'm happy to start. And again, thanks for having me today to be able to participate in this really important conversation. So I think the first part of your question is why is it important for folks on parole to be able to vote? And I first of all want to say, I think we all probably agree on that in a democracy, like no one should ever lose their right to vote. So ultimately, like that is our goal, and something that we will continue to work towards is restoring voting rights to currently incarcerated people as well. But folks on parole are folks who are in the community. You know, according to our state law, your sentence ends the day that you are released from incarceration. So parole is actually supposed to be a method to help folks reenter into society, or at least that's what it says on paper, right? So if this is supposed to be a term of time in which people are, you know, supposed to be able to, you know, feel like they're part of the community, then it's very important and they feel like their voice is important, that they have the ability to weigh in on the political process. So something that we talked about when we were doing our work around Prop 17 last year was, you know, folks are home, they're contributing to their communities, they're paying taxes, you know, isn't it an American principle to say no taxation without representation? There's a misconception that people impacted by incarceration don't care about voting. But what we also found was that folks who are impacted probably care about the laws more than the average person, because when you lose your rights and your freedom, you recognize most intimately how the laws can affect your everyday life. So, you know, those are just some of like the high level arguments that I wanted to highlight. But in terms of the work that we did here in California, and actually Brittany and the ACLU of Northern California were a very impactful coalition partner. We had tried a couple of years ago to actually restore voting rights to all people, which included currently incarcerated people. We had begun to circulate petitions to qualify an initiative for the ballot that would have done so. We're not able to get the signatures that we needed. However, the following year, we were able to introduce an assembly constitutional amendment through the legislature, which placed an initiative on the ballot that ultimately would restore voting rights to folks on parole. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that this idea for a campaign initially came to us from one of our members who's currently incarcerated. He's still incarcerated. His name is Rasan Thomas, and he had let us know, you know, how important it was for him to be able to have his right to vote, and you know what a change that could make in our state system if people impacted by incarceration had their voting rights restored. So this is an idea that started from the inside, that folks who were formerly incarcerated or like me had loved ones inside did a lot of the groundwork to make it happen. So this truly was like a grassroots effort in this state. So yeah, we spent the better part of 2019 and 2020 qualifying this initiative for the ballot, ultimately qualified it in summer of 2020. It became Proposition 17, which simply said that the day that you're released from prison, your voting rights are automatically restored. We were successful. We won with 58% of the vote in November of 2020, and actually won by a higher margin than any of the 12 ballot measures that were on the ballot for November in the state of California. So I think that was really like a testament to like the hard work that a lot of us have been doing on the ground for the past several years, especially around like narrative change and things like that. So it's encouraging to see that, you know, California, a state that's so big and so diverse, was able to take a step in this direction. But as you said, we're not the only state. Colorado and Nevada on the West Coast have also made similar strides in recent years. So eventually, I know that we do want to go back and continue with legislation or another ballot initiative, which is what it would probably require, to restore voting rights to folks in state and federal prison as well. California is unique in the sense that people in county jails can vote, people on county probation can vote. We have some other weird, like, post-release supervision situations. Folks under, those types of supervisions also have the right to vote. So there's also like a lot of confusion in the state because folks are not aware, like, well, does this felony count for this? Does this misdemeanor count for that? So a big thing that we were able to do with Proposition 17 was just kind of like make it easy to talk about and say, as long as you're not in state or federal prison, you can vote. And we actually just had an election on Tuesday the 14th, which is a special recall election where there was an attempt to recall our Democratic governor. And it was the first statewide election that folks on parole were able to vote in. So Initiate Justice was really involved in the grassroots efforts to register people on parole to vote, to let them know that their voting rights were restored. I know the ACLU and Brittany's really been taking the lead in like the top-down efforts and making sure that the Department of Corrections and Secretary of State is disseminating that information, but there's still so much misinformation out there. So I was really excited and proud that this was the first time that more than 50,000 people who are currently on parole had the opportunity to participate in the election. I'd be really interested to see like some of the numbers on the back end to see how many folks on parole did vote. But I can say from, anecdotal experience and, members on our staff and, members of our community who voted for the first time and were on parole, it was a very meaningful and impactful experience. So it's very exciting to see these strides being made. And I know that it's something that we're going to continue to work on.
I'm going to hand it over to James for the same question.
Yeah, so it's I guess to understand the issue, you have first to understand that we're not a ballot initiative state. So all of our judges are appointed, everyone's appointed through government. Your representation, is what it boils down to in our state. You and what it has done, I think, to Connecticut is that it's created a very lazy civic culture where you expect your representation to handle everything, and so people become very tribal around representation, but we all get the same results. We get representation by default because we have very poor voter turnout in the state. Unlock the Vote, the campaign kind of came about because at the time that I was released from prison, I wasn't thinking about my voting rights. I was just kind of thinking about like where I'm gonna live, and I was in a new city, and I had like this internship at CDFI in Hartford to turn into a policy analyst position, and it was in that work and that engagement when I started like understanding the disparities in banking and housing and food, and really looking at it through data and in the communities that I'm living in and walking through in this very wealthy state. I couldn't figure out what was going on, so I started sitting in these public hearings and seeing what was going on and seeing how the discussion on communities that I grew up in are being held, and who's holding the knowledge and the power and the decision making on things that are affecting our lives. And it became a thing to me, and I started talking about it a lot to my co-founder, who this was his brainchild, just in conversation, Pinar Ray. And he was like, "Yo, we can do this." And he's like, "Yo, this is what I do." And so from there, our campaign started, as well as like the Full Citizens Coalition. And it not being able to present or petition onto a ballot really left us with having to just have support within legislative, within our legislators to present our bill to sponsor us, and that became the hurdle. Legislation around this issue had never been presented. In 2002, persons on probation were given their rights back, and then everything stopped. And so now we're talking 2018, where we're trying to get legislation presented on full enfranchisement. We have two different bills: felony parole enfranchisement, and the end of suffrage, like everyone voting in prison. And these bills never made it. They never made it to the floor. But it was a really good year in networking and advocacy building within our representation, and really starting to shift farther into the community to make this a community issue, because there wasn't a culture that talked about this. There wasn't a culture that talked about the impact, because no one could see it. You can't see what you can't see. And so that's what we had to start pointing to people, that if you have 5,000 people impacted, then you have heads of homes, and you have entire homes impacted, and you have generational effects where people are disengaged for generations. It's not just the individual. And so being able to take this conversation into community, then start to talk in community spaces. And I don't mean community halls. I mean, we were holding full workshops in barbershops, salons, in front of Bravos or Walmart, because we had to catch everyone where they were at and in their day, and have them see the effects of what being locked out is. And a lot of times it was only because the spaces we were catching them that they can understand. We were able to make the disenfranchisement relatable to the space. Everything from being licensed as a barber and having a felony conviction, and how these things affect you. And then from there, we were able to start engaging people on how it has health effects, and how civic health is critical to every other health in our community, because policies shape the rest of our health. And so we have to have the ability to engage on a level with representation and in the shifting of policies around community issues. And in 2019, we prior to the pandemic, we had bipartisan support and sponsorship on our bill, and it died. And it really was disheartening to see that it never even made it to a vote. But going into the pandemic, we had just committed ourselves to being deeper into the community, and we had to hold to that through the pandemic, which was trying for 18 months. But having passed this bill and having created aided to the groundwork that led to not only this bill passing, but prison gerrymandering ending in our state, it gives us the most leverage we've had to end suffrage in the state now, because the bodies are no longer tied to the cities where they're held. They'll never leave where they're from. And so that changes how a lot of the conservative towns who house prisons view in-prison voting, because their number one complaint is that I don't want them voting in my town, but you like the benefits you get from the feds for having them in your town. So now that the benefit has ended, the argument just boils down to being racist, and we can make that argument. So.
Thank you, James, for really going through thank you both of you all for going through that and really expressing what the importance of voting on parole is, and how we have to make sure folks have these rights. And I'm glad that we've been able to cover both probation and parole, as it's a large sum of our loved ones who are currently on the outside, but still, being surveilled by the criminal justice system. So I do want to shift our focus a little bit. We all kind of talked about it a little bit, but not specifically hit on being disenfranchised due to our financial status and being poor. So now I want to shift the room to Brittany and welcome you back. Thank you so much for joining us. You're a staff attorney for the Democracy and Civic Engagement Program at the ACLU of Northern California, where you advocate to expand the franchise to all Californians and to reduce barriers to voting caused by the registration process. So along with the Initiate Justice and the rest of the Free the Vote Coalition, you are also part of a Prop 17 campaign that recently restored the voting rights of people in California. And so my question kind of shifts a little bit from that. Unfortunately, in some states, systems impacted folks may have to pay an outstanding fee or fines or restitution before their voting rights are restored. So essentially, they're being disenfranchised because they're poor, literally. Can you explain to us how this is a form of voter suppression and what work is being done to alleviate folks from being penalized due to being poor? Can you tell us what your organization and any other similar organizations are doing to reduce barriers for voting in California, specifically for impacted folks?
Absolutely. And thank you again for having me on the panel. So just to zoom out, as of 2020, there were about 5.2 million Americans who were prohibited from voting due to laws that disenfranchise people convicted of felony offenses. And many of them, you could argue the vast majority of them, that's in some way or another related to financial inequality. We know that people who end up incarcerated in the first place who are people who are low income or have no income. People who have money are able to either immediately bail themselves out by the best lawyers or don't get arrested and incarcerated in the first place. But as we've talked about today, each state has a different law around felony disenfranchisement. And so the degree to which those laws directly disenfranchise people because of their inability to pay fines and fees varies across states. Most states don't directly explicitly disenfranchise people if they don't pay fees, but several do directly tie financial obligations to voting, and many more of them indirectly hinge restoration of voting rights on the ability to pay fines and fees. So for example, a July 2019 report by the Campaign Legal Center and the Georgetown Law Civil Rights Clinic called Can't Pay, Can't Vote showed that at least 30 states continue to disenfranchise some of their citizens based on wealth. So 8 states explicitly require payment of either all or some fines and fees before restoration of voting rights. Those states are Alabama, Arizona, Arkansas, Florida, Tennessee, Connecticut, Georgia, and Washington as of 2019, recognizing there's been lots of change in the last 2 years. 2 states, Iowa and Kentucky, had permanent disenfranchisement, but required fines and fees to be able to seek restoration of voting rights through the pardon process. And then 20 states either implicitly required payment of fees and fines as a prerequisite to voting rights restoration by requiring the completion of parole or probation, which, as we'll talk about, has a lot to do with your ability to pay fines and fees in many states. So the example of a state that explicitly requires fee payment for rights restoration, which some people may be most familiar with, is Florida. And that's because Florida felony disenfranchisement laws have been in the news a lot over the last couple of years. Up until 2018, Florida had lifetime voting rights removal for anyone who was convicted of even a single felony of any kind. They had a process for restoring rights, theoretically, by applying to a panel, but that panel was incredibly biased and rights restoration was incredibly rare. So because of that law, as of 2018, 1.6 million otherwise eligible adult citizens in California couldn't vote. By design, that is a form of voter suppression that disproportionately harmed Floridians of color. So for example, 1 in 3 Black men in Florida could not vote because of that law. I remember going to Florida to knock on doors to try to push for this campaign for Amendment 4, which I'll talk about in a second. And I saw that play out just in knocking on doors in a Black neighborhood. I talked to Black men, and about a third of them that I talked to said, "Oh, I can't sign that petition because I don't have the right to vote," which was really harrowing. So in November 2018, thanks to a huge grassroots campaign led by the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and many others, Florida voters overwhelmingly by 65% passed an initiative, Amendment 4, to restore voting rights to people who had been convicted of most kinds of felonies once the person had completed their sentence. But sadly, Florida's legacy of using felony disenfranchisement as a tool of racist voter suppression has very deep roots, and the state's lawmakers refused to allow the will of the voters to stand. So in 2019, Governor Ron DeSantis signed SB 7066, which defined completing a sentence for purposes of voting rights restoration to include fully paying your restitution and any fines, fees, or costs resulting from the conviction. So as broad as you can write that, really. This had the effect of basically undoing Amendment 4's win for the vast majority of folks who would have otherwise gotten their rights back. Florida didn't even have a cohesive system for tracking who still owed fines and fees. So most of those 1.6 million people remain disenfranchised. Many advocates, including ACLU, challenged that new law, arguing that it amounted to a poll tax because it essentially created a pay-to-play system for voting in the state. For brief context, in 1966, the US Supreme Court, of course, struck down a $1.50 poll tax as an unconstitutional restriction on the right to vote. And poll taxes, of course, were one of many forms of Jim Crow voter suppression that were used to strip political power from Black and brown Americans. Today, people convicted or even just charged with even a minor crime are often charged for the cost of their own punishment, which includes everything from booking costs on arrest, room and board during incarceration, rehabilitative programs, medical costs, and more, much, much more. So on top of this, there's often tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars or more sometimes that someone can be ordered to pay in victim restitution. One study showed that the average returning citizen owed over $13,000 upon their release, but for many people that can be much more. So as of 2019, in total, an estimated 10 million people owed about $50 billion in fines and fees nationwide as the result of criminal convictions. Yet, because of course of intersecting forms of discrimination, about 27% of formerly incarcerated folks are unemployed, and those who have employment often make very low income, and many will never be able to completely pay off their fines and fees in the course of their lives. So nonetheless, despite this context, in September 2020, the 11th Circuit Federal Court of Appeal found that the Florida law requiring fee payment was not unconstitutional. Many lawyers and community advocates have been working hard in the last couple of years to clear as many Floridians as possible of their outstanding fines and fees, but unfortunately, the Sentencing Project currently estimates that about 900,000 people still owe financial obligations in Florida and remain disenfranchised. So this is obviously truly unfair and undemocratic. But so where does that leave us? Where does our collective fight for justice go from here? Obviously, we keep going because the systems of oppression that we've been talking about today were built step by step and year by year, and that's going to be how we dismantle them as well. There's many different strategies that we've talked about today. I think for Florida, the next stop in the case would obviously be the Supreme Court next if they continue to appeal it. But right now, we don't have a very justice-minded Supreme Court, to be honest, or at least the majority. And so there may be strategic reasons not to appeal the 11th Circuit decision to the Supreme Court. Alternatively, advocates on the ground in Florida could go back to the ballot to rewrite Amendment 4 to make it clear that fines and fees payment is not part of completing your sentence. So kind of going back to what we were saying before about trying the different tools that we have in our toolbox. And it just shows that these fights are really rooted in the local communities that are directly affected by them. So much of the work that we talk about when we talk about electoral politics is national, especially like when we talk about presidential races. And it's often the on-ramp for many people, but really the majority of the change that we can make to improve voting access for people with convictions is at the state and local level, writing and organizing for the policies that we want to see enacted. And of course, we can support each other like we're doing right now by sharing resources and strategies, but it's going to be piece by piece. And for California here, I think that's a great example of what Taina was talking about earlier. This was a multi-year campaign to pass Prop 17. It started as trying to restore voting rights for everyone. That was it was a bit too much of a policy hurdle, I think, at that point. So we went for people who were on parole, and that was successful. It took a lot of different strategies and perspectives and skills and resources and time, but we did it. And as Taina said, our coalition was explicit that we wanted to come back for people who are in prison. So the fight is not over here in California either. We're going to come back in a few years and try to completely eliminate felony disenfranchisement. And, now we're in the stage where we're working on implementation, as Taina talked about. So that includes both, vigorous voter education and outreach to make sure that people know their rights. And then it also includes making sure that government agencies are not spreading misinformation. For example, ACLU just did a research project. We looked at just the websites for all 58 counties in California. More than half of them for the registrars of voters had incorrect information about voter eligibility more than 6 months after Prop 17 passed. Which these are the elections officials for the counties, not talking about probation departments, jails, et cetera, which I'm sure are even worse. So there's a lot of work to be done just to make sure the right information is out there. And then we need to think creatively about streamlining access. So can we implement automatic voter registration for people who are applying for IDs as they're leaving prison? Can we require the parole department to offer voter registration every time someone checks in for a parole supervision meeting, et cetera? And then, of course, as we've talked about, we have to make sure that people who have already had the right to vote but are facing significant logistical barriers, like Carmen talked about earlier, who are perhaps in jail, for instance, just getting a pen to fill out a ballot can be really difficult. You know, being prohibited from having staples can mean you don't get access to your voter information guide. So on that, I'll just stop kind of going through the different things that you could do. But if you want to check out a resource that ACLU of Northern California has, I would check out letmevoteca.org. So there's a toolkit on there for voting in jail, and it also has a lot of resources for people with convictions to know what their rights are.
Thank you so much, Brittany. That actually opens the door for my next question that I wanted to have everyone, provide a response to. You all are amazing advocates in your field. And I was wondering if you could please share actionable items, kind of like Brittany just went through, on how folks can be engaged and restore their own voting rights or help efforts to restore the rights of others in their communities. So yeah, if anyone that wants to chime in on this answer, I'm sure our audience would really love to know what they can do, to get involved.
I mean, I think something that everybody should definitely do is be familiar with what the voting rights provisions are in their own state. And, for people that are maybe, headstrong, involved in a campaign, then they know all of this, but other folks might be like, I don't know who's doing what. They may not be familiar with, their state might be, kind of off the radar in a sense, but not just understand the law, like the letter or whatever, but also the practice. And, even call your local registrar and say like, oh, my brother has a felony conviction, or yourself, right? And I'm curious, like, how do I register to vote? In some states it's, if you're eligible, you're eligible, and it's just like anybody else. And in others, kind of as Brittany and everyone's talking about, there's, these other little nuances. So everyone should be super familiar with their own state and try to, to join forces with people that have active voting rights campaigns. And if you have a very strong and progressive law in your state, then work within it and build that base of people who are impacted. And then finally, I'd say there's a bill right now in Congress, what are they calling it now? The new one. Someone help me out.
I think it's called the Freedom to Vote
Freedom to Vote Act. Yeah, thank you. Freedom to Vote Act. And amongst some of the things within the 592 pages, which is a little bit scaled down from the bit more robust bill previously, but what this bill would do for our folks is do automatic voter registration for all people, at 18 or eligibility, et cetera, but also for people who are not in prison when you finish your prison sentence. And so, as we all know from our work, the prison creates a little bit easier dividing line for making the fight, and it becomes so challenging for the system to take people who are free to walk into the polling station, decide that some can vote, some can't. Some can if they have paid enough or if they've done enough hoops. And so that becomes at least a great starting point of saying anybody who with a felony conviction, whether you're on supervision or not, should have the right to vote. So I encourage everyone to call their Congress people, email their senators, et cetera, and support this very important thing, because really it's just about democracy, nothing else.
Nice. So I do have one more question for all of you all before we wrap up this really amazing talk. Thank you all for educating our community on all these important issues. I want to ask one final question. Are there any other current issues or forms of voter suppression that systems impacted communities and members of our audience should be informed of as they navigate returning home?
Well, I definitely want to just shout out, the fact that misinformation is really, a detriment in our work, and people will often not be familiar with what the law is. And, we encounter this here, but people have elsewhere, where they think you get a conviction, you're disenfranchised for life. And, the law in Florida, for instance, was a national story. And so people who live in Montana might think that they have the same law. So we're not always really good, I think, in explaining that each state has its own little nuance when it comes to criminal conviction penalties. So I think understanding, what word on the street is, and figuring out how to combat that so that the street can actually be educating itself.
And just really quickly to Brian's point, or to Bruce's point, sorry, Bruce, is that educating and reaching out to your credible sources on what it means to vote this way or that way, and just being really well informed before going to the polls to cast your ballot, or if you're doing it from home, whatever, just be really informed as to what it is and how it is you're voting. And if you have any questions on whether I can or cannot vote, reach out to your local nonprofit organization that provides free legal service. In California, in the Bay Area, Root and Rebound. We have it out in we're out in Fresno as well, South Carolina and Southern California. But just know where to go, and have that information ready. So when the time comes to vote again, that you're well informed. So it's just so important, and your vote counts, your vote matters.
Try to make any conversation around this issue as commonplace in your life as anything else. Like it's a grocery store conversation, a dinner table conversation, because I'm from my experience and where I live, civics isn't a thing that is engaged in or talked about in those areas. And so the disengagement is so large. We have representation by lack of vote. It's and understanding the power we actually have in municipal ballots and in our local races and gubernatorial races is super important. And normalizing that, I think it just means just have the conversations, ask the questions, dispel the misinformation, and spread the right stuff, like in the smallest of spaces. So.
Great point, James. I think that is so important. Yes, have that conversation. Don't be afraid to talk about it, or just inform, educate, right? Your own people, your own family, make it a normal conversation to get involved. So yeah, thanks for pointing that out, James.
Well, thank you all. We have been honored to have you in this space and to learn so much from you all. I want to close the program by reminding us of the value that we are highlighting today, which is to create. We are the architects of our survival. This day is dedicated to our new realities through advocacy, programming, and storytelling. And I think that this event did just that. We are creating what we want to see moving forward in terms of our rights. And so I would just want to give you all a round of applause and hope that you will join us again. And I hope that the audience will join us for the rest of the week of action and awareness as we continue to have events throughout the country. So thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thank you.